Probably almost everyone who has encountered something strange, ill-explained, and frightening in life has wondered, what was it? What touched him, brutally and directly, or even lightly, in passing, maybe without even noticing? Such doubts and conjectures can torment a lifetime, forcing one to relive the moments when this something happened again and again. And the more time passes, the more the mind, burdened by the axioms of everyday life, is tormented by another thought: did it happen at all? It's much easier for me. I know that it didn't just happen. It exists. And, most likely, it still exists, even if in the form of an unremarkable object. The last time I saw it was 3 years ago. I held it in my hands and even actuated it. It certainly exists. But that doesn't make it any easier. In that difficult year, having brilliantly obtained a prestigious major at the university, I discovered that it was too prestigious and that there were far more people who wanted to study it than there were jobs. In between occasional summer jobs, I never gave up hope of getting where I wanted to go. But with each useless office doorstep, hope faded, and with the first cold weather and meager finances, it dried up altogether. Having not very crooked hands, I was moonlighting as a minor repairman. It was then that the sister of my long-dead stepfather, whom I had seen a couple or 3 times before, came to visit me. Her name was Aunt Sonia. Aunt Sonia was a correspondent for a regional television channel. Her husband Stefan worked as a cameraman there as well. They say common work kills a marriage. With these two, it was just the opposite. They both loved to work. As a rule, they made reports together, and all their free time they devoted to trips across the country and abroad, and when they stayed in the city they partied with colleagues and friends. They had no children. I don't know if that was the reason or the consequence of such a life. It turned out that my aunt had received a long-awaited transfer to the head office of the channel, which was in the distant state capital. Of course, she was traveling with her husband. In the absence of close family or friends she could trust, they remembered I existed and, dragging me out to the meeting, asked me to help with a few things. The first order of business was to look after their apartment for the 2 months they were to spend in the new place. I had to visit the apartment 3 times a week, take care of the houseplants, and take care of the collection of television recordings that Stefan had accumulated over the years. The second job, which arose after I told him about myself, was to renovate one of the rooms, for which I was promised good pay. "Don't rush into it, it's not much," said Aunt Sonia. "And don't forget about the diploma. Once we get settled around here, I'll try to help you, too. There aren't many opportunities here. The metropolis is another matter." And that's how it was decided. The next morning I was brought to the apartment, given the keys and a few more instructions of a mostly paranoid nature, like close the windows at night and don't talk to the old lady in apartment 45. After promising to do everything, I helped the couple load their bags into a cab and, wishing them a safe journey, went to the current order. I returned from work exhausted and angry. The customer had quarreled with our chief and told him to redo half of the finished area without giving me a cent. As a result of the quarrel, the boss stopped the work and sent the crew home. It was a shame. My partners lived nearby. I had to trudge through the yards to the bus stop, and then drive home for almost an hour. On the way home, I went into a convenience store and, taking out some change in front of the cash register, fumbled for something sharp in my pocket. A keychain in the shape of our city's television tower, and the keys were on it. Only now I remembered that I had to check my aunt's apartment. I didn't want to be out in the middle of the night. I realized, however, that I didn't have to go far. The house was almost across the street from where I was going to work today. I entered the house, took off my shoes, walked through the rooms, and closed the curtains as I had been told. Everything was in order, things were in place, the bed had been put away, the tables and nightstands were cleared of junk, as if the apartment was ready for tenants. As I was about to leave, the refrigerator rumbled in the kitchen. Immediately, I wanted to stay. I had already missed the last bus, and I did not want to spend money on a cab. No one was waiting for me at home, and the groceries for dinner were bought. And I could go from looking after the house to working as a security guard. Soon a simple dinner was ready, the TV was on, and the couch was turned into a place to sleep. All evening I cursed the idiot customer, mean employers who sent me away, cheating professors and the dean promising graduates the mountain of gold, myself for the wrong choice of profession, the TV for the stupid programs and commercials. And then, wandering aimlessly around the room, I saw a rack full of bright squares. Television is supposed to surprise, entertain, and hook the audience for the sake of ratings and revenue growth. Each channel does it in its own way, but I didn't respond much to these grimaces. Performances by previously unknown talents from the people, endless dirty bickering by long-known talents from the capitals, shows, and soap operas. You'd better get your own show on the air somehow. The collection would have to be more interesting, because people, sophisticated in television, aren't likely to collect all that crap. Before I had time to think about it, I unlocked the glass doors. On the shelves were hundreds of CDs cluttered with felt-tip notations on the pockets or the upper plane. Short words, abbreviations, numbers. Sometimes just dates. You couldn't even get a rough idea of the content from them. Curious. They didn't tell me I couldn't touch the discs. They told me to be careful. If I read them, I wouldn't violate anything, would I? And there was hardly anything in the collection that wasn't meant for other people's eyes. Especially since the player was right there, winking its green eye, perched on the back of the TV. At that time the internet was just blooming in the regions, and these flat devices with a softly rustling womb were found in many homes. After wrinkling my nose a bit, I ran my finger over the shelf-labeled region and, turning on the player, started up the first CD I could find. I sat down on the couch. These were recordings of working material from various events that had taken place in my city in recent years. Here was a military parade for May 9th in Russia, filmed from the balcony of a building overlooking the square, as I understood it, next to City Hall. Selected excerpts from interviews with veterans. The day was gray and windy. Next was a recording of a tour of the local history museum, where Chinese professors were received. The tour guide talked languidly about the founding of the city, the professors nodded and spoke Chinese, the pleasant girl roughly translated. Everyone was alternately poked by rods and furry balls of microphones. After that there were quite boring interviews with the employees of Aunt Sonia's channel, which I, yawning, scrolled through at top speed, and then the tapes ran out. After carefully returning the CD, I went to bed, making plans for a new part-time job. In the morning I reported to my aunt that all was quiet in the apartment, and politely asked if I could stay here periodically. My aunt didn't mind, except to not bring anyone into the house. We agreed to call every third day and I, emboldened by this start to the day, went through the phone numbers found in the newspaper ads for jobs. Alas, nothing good came of the day, and to top it all off, the chief called and said that the crew would not be working while the problems with the damn customer were sorted out. That meant all next week. In those days I was overcome by sullenness and hostility in the streets, followed by a deafening depression that overcame me in the apartment. The search for work did not cheer me up. October had begun, rarefied thin rays oozed from the sky, and the mornings were chilly. All living things shrank. Time froze. I didn't want anything. I lived on automatic, eating lonely dinners, fruitlessly calling numbers from advertisements and watering flowers, all in a dreary apathy. Maybe the apartment itself was affecting me with its atmosphere. Such a peculiar, compressed coziness, pressing a little on my brain. The rooms of the old apartment faced both sides of the house. One part was almost dark from the thick, even after the leaves had died down, trees in the yard and the barn-like, cluttered balcony that obscured the sun even at noon. In the other, there was always a sickly pale light. Outside the window of that room lay a deserted highway, beyond it stretched brown wasteland with rows of garages and the ruins of a long-abandoned mine, and beyond, as far as the faded sky, a gray-yellow wild steppe. A surprisingly strong sense of loss and my own insignificance tickled my chest as I gazed into the uncomfortable distance and realized that my aunt's house was the outermost dwelling in the city. The thick foliage of the tall trees muffled the sounds of the busy yard, making them distant, as if I lived atop a skyscraper, but the branches often tapped the balcony windows. Thick walls and ceilings reliably obscured most of the noise from the neighboring apartments, giving the impression that I was here all alone. Only the occasional loud music of someone's party filled the thick air of the rooms with soft waves of strange, distorted to unprecedented rhythms. And then there were the old floors, which was what I needed to fix, not creaking, but quietly, modestly clicking and popping in all sorts of places, as if the house was breathing. In another situation, I wouldn't have gone into that gloomy apartment on top of my schedule, but my dislike for people was doing its part. And then there was this. That very collection. It, like an improved Pandora's box, took up all my free time, capturing my attention and saving me from boredom. I had forgotten all about regular TV. From morning until late afternoon, I leisurely traveled from the shelf to the record player and from there to the couch. I was fascinated by the contents and began to explore it in earnest. More precisely, I tried to understand the principle of classification and the basis for the value of this or that record. I was pleased with the feeling of complicity to the secret. Who else in our city had access to such unusual things? I enjoyed watching the rare films with crooked, obviously homemade subtitles, funny and not so funny bits of news reports, unusual commercials, and full versions of newsreels, fragments of which are flashed on TV. Some were cute, some were funny, some were boring and perplexing. What's so special about that? Apparently, for professionals, all the recordings had some rare nuances or flaws. Like typos on rare stamps, which philatelists go crazy about. But never mind. I was amused by the swearing at the camera operator, pretending to be Malvina and presenting some old children's show. And then there was Mr. Jackson, a familiar to me from my childhood, a no longer working announcer of the regional news, beating with his boot a rat, which frightened his partner and was rushing back and forth in the studio. Not so funny was the rehearsal for the governor's meeting. The flabby gray-haired man yelled so much at the fidgety guys who made the wrong dance move that I wanted to punch him in the ear. Seeing that he was being filmed, the official waved his hands in fright. The most unpleasant part was the jagged, oblique shot of the big crash with the snow dented in red pits and in places just drenched in scarlet streams. In the background of the shot, paramedics were bagging several bodies. When I was done with the domestic records, I moved on to the foreign shelf. There was more variety here, but also without too much sophistication. Poor quality recordings of Asian programs whose characters performed stupid or downright brutal tasks, weird commercials of all kinds, funny moments filmed during live broadcasts, obscure broadcasts of boxing and bare-knuckle fights. I once got hooked on watching snippets of African TV shows for an entire evening. Turns out there are some. A month went by. My aunt and her husband were doing well. I too cheered up and was already figuring out where to start renovating. Most of the collection was a cursory look through. It wasn't that the discs disappointed me, just that I expected more from a selection like this. Going through the colored pockets somehow in search of a hint of the title of the content, I came across a readable, but therefore no more understandable inscription. "We see." Or maybe not. The disc, like the pocket itself, was worn, old, and covered with brown dots like drips of dried mud. The ink pen with which the writing was made was the same color. Well, let's try to figure it out. The disc rustled familiarly, but the screen remained black. I even thought the media was faulty, but didn't bother to rewind it. The blackness didn't change. I stared at the TV like a fool for 2 minutes, and the longer this gloomy pause lasted, the more intrigued I became. And then, in complete silence and darkness, a pair of human eyes opened abruptly. I almost jumped on the couch, although I am not afraid of such effects, and it was light outside the window. Apparently, the body reacts to the change in the situation before comprehending. Physiology. There was nothing frightening about the screen eyes. They were a sparse yellow hue, clearly alive, not painted. They looked to me like a woman's. A quiet, sad melody began to play. I don't know what to compare it to. Closer, I think, to ethno-music, but what country, I will not say. After about half a minute, eyes disappeared into blackness again. The music died down, and a soft, pleasant male voice sounded in the background. I did not understand the language. Out of the darkness emerged a photo of a sturdy, middle-aged man in a stylish business suit. Dark hair with a parting, dark skin, clear and kind eyes. Beneath the portrait ran a short inscription in Latin letters and some, probably numbers, written in an incomprehensible font. I couldn't shake the impression that these images resembled the sad screensaver of a TV channel that had reported the death of its founder a long time ago. Both the music and the announcer's solemn and sad tone indicated the obvious: it was a mourning video. The portrait changed to a new view, a beautiful city shown from a great height. Tower-like bright houses with avenues and yards wrapped in bright greenery, and on the horizon, a low bluish upland. It might as well have been Caracas or Ashgabat. The pace of the speech increased. I tried to catch the repetitions to find out the name of the country or the name of the person, evidently an important politician, but most likely the head of state. In short sequences of video sequences, a man was driving a huge tractor across an endless green field, addressing a crowd of raggedly dressed listeners, standing on the edge of a forest, smiling from a podium at the crews of striped tanks passing over the parade ground. Looking more closely, I realized they were not tanks, but fire or rescue vehicles. Instead of turrets, they had water hoses, with bulldozer blades attached to the front. And the announcer went on talking. Here an unknown monarch or president is shaking hands with old men in metal jackets. Then he gives a speech at the opening of a huge open-work bridge over a river with dark rushing waters, filled with brightly painted boats. Snow whitens on the banks, but the chief is dressed in the same costume. And there, leaning over, he strokes the heads of children carrying 3 flowers that look like chrysanthemums in their hands. Sometimes there seemed to be one word repeated in the stream of unfamiliar speech. We see, the voiceover intensely said. Maybe it was just a search for a clue in the alien stream of sounds, though. The caption didn't appear again, and I still didn't know where or when the recording was made. This should have been tense and even alarming, but I was more absorbed by the strange sight than alarmed. It didn't last long, but it seemed like an eternity to me. The scenes of the unknown figure's life were cut short again by a black background, but a portrait quickly appeared in the center of the screen. This time, the hero of the tape was looking at me almost in full face. A smile bared small white teeth. As soon as the image appeared, a sound came, too, a new one, and one that frightened me no small amount. There was heavy panting, and then the women cried in quick succession, their bitter sobs interspersed with a wistful, almost animal howl. The cries echoed through the tunnels. There were many, many more women here. A whole chorus of mourners. There was nothing special about it, in fact, but imagine me, standing alone in a half-dark room in front of a hypnotizing screen, showing a strange and unfunny chronicle of the life of a man who was no longer there. Of the latter I was sure. The unknown man was mourned by his whole country. As the weeping intensified, the portrait began to approach smoothly. The mourners were already almost shrieking, as if torn to pieces alive. Howls and squeals filled the apartment, and the white-toothed face kept growing until it began to dissipate, disintegrating into dots like a dot matrix printer. When the dead man's collapsing eyes looked up at me, crouched on the couch, the wailing finally broke into a single, searing scream with 100 tones, and, as it grew, it pierced my ears, filling my skull and resonating painfully in my throat. The darkness swelled, disintegrated into layers and shreds, and I suddenly found myself slouching under the side of the couch, poking blindly at the remote, which wouldn't stop the little screen hell. I thought the face that had become a nightmare was about to crush me, but the right button had already been pressed, and all that was left on the screen was a fat menu bar with the same ugly "we see" in Latin. Howling at the sight of the dreaded word, I squeezed the other remote until it crunched, and the screen, dancing and blinking, blinded me with a vivid color picture. From downstairs I looked up at the cheering people who were happily and disbelievingly listening to a pop tune. On the stage of the crowded auditorium some unknown artists were singing. "Oh, people," I muttered in relief as I rose from the floor. There was a thump outside. I looked back at the window with a twitch. The evening had not yet melted, and it was shimmering in pale shards through the thick mosaic of branches. The wind howled, and the branches poked against the balcony glass again. The floorboards in the kitchen snapped muffled. Sunset rays from the opposite room crept into my dark room, making their way toward me in a trail of crimson glare. How had I missed the sunset? I quickly turned on the lights and turned the TV volume almost up. I was relieved at once. I never went to bed or left the house right after watching unpleasant things. Maybe superstition. tried to switch the negative stuff to any upbeat, fun movie or program. That way the bad stuff is erased and the residue from the spectacle washed away, not lingering in my mind. I stared at the soccer game until I caught myself peering into the darkened doorways after the lights were turned on. Stupid. Well, a retarded epitaph, so what? Maybe it works on the local people, like fanatics, but what about you? You know, the Koreans had bears crying when the Secretary General died. You never know, I reassured myself, staring into the flicker of colored figures on the green of the stadium. Then I got up reluctantly, opened the disk drive with the remote control and took out an unpleasant disk. It seemed heavier than the others. The strange inscription stabbed my eye, and I quickly shoved the disk into the pocket and the pocket into the rack. I jumped up when I heard a great rustling in the hallway. It was like someone coming in from a rainy street and shaking off a wet umbrella. I turned off the TV and, armed with a fork from my salad plate, moved slowly, with a fierce look, into the hallway. It was empty and gloomy. I exhaled, flicked the light switch, and moved more slowly toward the front door. There was a pang of despair. Why was this stupid apartment planned in such a way that I couldn't see out the back of the hallway? No dark kitchen in front, no dark bedroom behind me. The echoes of the wild chorus of seeing were still echoing in my ears. I pulled myself together and walked briskly, like a robot, into the kitchen, turning on the light there as well. It was empty and quiet, not silent. The old floors, relieved by the weight of my footsteps, creaked lazily, like the footsteps of an invisible stroller. Ugh! I went back to the door and looked out the peephole. The slightly curved lens of the entryway was imprinted like a retouched noir film. The edges of the stairs, the window cutout, where the branches were moving in the wind. On the landing, a fat black and white cat was fussing in front of the neighbor's door. He must have been shaking off at my doorstep, or a draft had flown in through the cracked glass of the entryway on the floor below. It happens. The cat calmed me down somehow. I could hear the neighbor's commotion behind the walls, too. The hinges creaked, an older voice called to the cat, and the door shut. All was well. There are people around, some kids are running around in the yard, and a cat lives right next door. I cooked dinner to the sound of the television and, after watching a comedy, I went to bed. The light in the hallway was left on. A dryness in my throat made me wake up. It was a dismal, dull light outside the windows. I squinted at the light burning in the corridor, wandered to the kitchen to the cold kettle, drank water, and went back. But I did not reach the couch. My heart had no time to give a fright and my brain to startle, when a soft, invisible yoke fell on my shoulders, and my head tilted back against my will. I stared at the floor and stared dumbly, without blinking, at my socks and the pattern on the carpet, illuminated by the light bulb. And a strange heaviness had already braided my shoulders and chest in a serpentine ring. There was a faint gasp above my ear. Despite the chill, my neck and back were soaking wet, and the hair on my arms stood on end and my skin was rippling. I wondered why I was in the middle of nowhere at this hour, and what kept me from sleeping at home. But even these thoughts passed, replaced suddenly by an unreasonable, irresistible wave of sadness and regret. Not about myself, not about my life, not about anything else that could be regretted in such a situation. No. One thing became abundantly clear to me: he who leaves this world will never return to it. He would do nothing more, make no one happy, not even see this damp night darkness. Even the horror of my situation receded before the magnitude of the truth revealed to me. I sighed and sank further. And I realized that what was holding me was sympathetic, hugging me tightly, almost amicably. It, too, knew the secret. And it wasn't filled with otherworldly malice, but with a more eerie force and understanding of fragility, a dull autumnal longing. I blinked and sniffed my nose. The creature pressed tighter against me and sobbed softly over my ear. Bitterly, wistfully, mooing and shuddering. Just like those clueless mourners in the video. And so was I, tucking my nose into the invisible softness, mourning all the things that won't work, won't happen, because they're already dead. Yes, it was her after all, kept crying, trembling, and clinging to my arms, and suddenly, whispering hotly to me in an unknown language, she loosened her embrace. She comforted me. And then it stopped. I waddled to the couch, depressed and shattered, and covered my head with a blanket and fell into a dead sleep. I woke up late, disgusted and dizzy, sick in the head. I walked to the bathroom, noting something wrong on the way, came back to the living room, realized that the lamp in the hallway was not turned off, and immediately remembered everything. I began to hurriedly get ready for the exit, not realizing where I was going. I hurried to get out of here. Something clicked. Through the window of the empty bedroom. On the side where there were no trees. I cursed so loudly that I must have alarmed the whole entryway, and, jumping into my boots, ran out the door, slamming it shut with a rattle, frantically twisting the key in the lock. He rolled down the stairs, ran into the courtyard, and hopped on the first bus he saw. When he saw it pass the windows of his aunt's apartment, he gritted his teeth and crossed to the other side, turning his head to the side until his neck hurt. When he reached the terminus, he got out on the street and, running across the lot, took the same bus, causing the conductor to look suspiciously sneering. I got out in the center and went straight to the interview, received in response politely unconscious smiles, went somewhere else, and again. Tired of the fact that the people around me didn't want to understand me, I slipped into a crowded cafe where I had lunch and decided to call Aunt Sonia, warning her that, unfortunately, I wouldn't be able to be on duty or fix her apartment. The excuse was made up, and as I reached for my phone, I jabbed my fingers into the empty gut of my pocket. I felt around for myself. I realized that the phone, almost all the cash, and the keys to my own place were still there. I should have gone back, but I was afraid. I sat for a long time at the empty plates and wondered who could help me. Acquaintances would agree, but they lived far away and I couldn't call them. Ask my aunt's neighbors? But I wondered, had I even seen neighbors in this dingy entryway? Only heard them. I'd heard too many things in general these days. The cat was, yes. And the neighbors. The only thing that made me come back was the beginning of dusk. If I was going to enter the apartment, it would have to be before daylight. Scolding myself, I spent the last of my fair money, rushed resolutely to the floor, and unlocked the apartment. It was quiet and peaceful. I quickly found my things, and, tormented by even a waking conscience, I filled the bathroom with water and watered the dried-up flowers. I'll call from the street, I decided, turning off the lights in the rooms and, making sure I hadn't forgotten anything, opened the bathroom door to put the watering can on the floor. As I bent down, a whiff of air wafted from the darkness of the room, and my hair was quickly stroked by someone's heavy hand. I screamed and squealed so that I was deaf, and with my whole body I rushed to the front door, which, of course, I locked on entering. I thundered, nearly broke the lock on the door, and, abandoning the apartment, dashed out into the street for the second time that day. Twilight was gathering, the rain was pouring down. After waiting out the hot panic wave in the courtyard gazebo, I remembered, I needed to make a phone call. I let out some nonsense and, without waiting for questions, asked which neighbor I could leave the keys with. My aunt predictably resisted giving the keys to strangers, but, realizing that I was adamant, reluctantly told me to go to the head of the house. I returned to the cursed house literally on tiptoe and, thanking all the gods that the Akrabltea lived in another entranceway, got even with the burden. An hour later I was at a noisy birthday party for an acquaintance, where my appearance and confused speech didn't raise many questions. But if bad movies can be interspersed with impressions of good ones, it works worse with life. When the fun was over, I squeezed into a cab with the largest group of revelers. I got out of the car later than everyone else, at some bar, and hung out there until daylight. Got home by noon. Afraid of sleeping in the dark, I set the alarm for 7 p.m. and fell into a deep, dreamless slumber. I woke up, oddly enough, sane and even rested. I went to the store, with little fear of darkness, had a snack all night, and stared at the TV. Normal, no scary records. I forbade myself to think about what had happened. A day passed, another. On the third day, the boss called me and told me the dispute over that house had been resolved in favor of the crew. I was back in business and got some money. And just a week later, I finally got a job in my specialty. Not my dream job, of course, but pretty close to it. Thanks for that. Aunt Sonia was offended at first and did not contact me. but almost immediately after returning to town called me and dryly asked where I could find good repairmen. I advised her people from his brigade, where he had recently left, and refused to come in to visit, politely explaining that the apartment was uncomfortable. The indignant aunt was reassured by an agreement to meet anywhere but their home. She remained perplexed, which I dispelled as best I could at the meeting in the cafe. I made excuses for the bad streak in my life, the depression of October, the strange atmosphere of the apartment itself, the bad dreams, and the fatigue. Said everything except that disc. Is that all? Aunt Sonia frowned. I wanted to say, no, of course not, and then tell her all the horror that had happened. But realizing that it threatened to be taken for a madman or a drug addict, I answered, only. But that was enough for me. She stared at me anxiously for half a minute, and, with a sigh, said, "What's the matter with you? Did you remember to close the curtains? You did not talk to that neighbor?" And seeing my bewilderment, she told me that for 5 years she and her husband rarely invited guests to their house. Or rather, the guests themselves did not want to stay there. They complained about the stuffiness and stale air, their headaches, their nightmares. I'm not superstitious, my aunt told me confidentially, lowering her tone. But while I was working, I talked to all kinds of people, and I know all kinds of things. And I've seen a couple of them myself. She began to say something about destiny and energy, and ended with suspicions of the evil eye of the unsociable and jealous neighbors in the entrance hall. I, expecting from her revelations about strange discs, strained, not knowing whether to confess to her what happened or to wait for a hint on the source of the harm. But I soon made sure that the woman herself believed in stupid esotericism, preached to the public from the pages of books and TV screens. Yes, my aunt seriously thought that the old woman from the 45th was responsible for the bad things. And no meditation and wrapped in a rug on the doorstep of the apartment spells written on a sheet of school notebook did not help. She told me something else about the old lady peeping into other people's windows at night, but I didn't listen, thinking that if some unknown evil power worked mainly on guests, then my aunt and her husband had got something like immunity to it over the years of collecting discs. I didn't want to find out for myself, and my aunt had nothing to do with the strange collection, though I was tempted to ask about it. But I didn't tell her anything. Since that rainy day, the revived mortal sadness hadn't touched me, and it would have been foolish to sound crazy in my relative's eyes. I sympathized, shook my head, and turned the conversation to the thwarted repair. I do not know whether Aunt Sonia believed in my sincerity, but we did not return to the otherworldly force. I was happy with my job. Almost the job I had dreamed of. Things were getting better. After a couple of years I was promoted and went to another city. I worked hard, but with pleasure, and rented inexpensive accommodations. I met a wonderful girl. The story with the tape was so deeply rooted in my subconscious that it seemed like a drunken dream, which I had almost forgotten. And if I remembered occasionally, I seriously doubted whether it had ever happened at all. When I went to my hometown to visit old friends, I found out that my aunt's husband was also planning to return there for the summer. We left together by train, and on the way he invited me to meet his gang, as he called the company of fellow journalists and other individuals, as far as I knew, who were as enthusiastic and crazy as he and my aunt were. After the restaurant, the most faithful and steadfast friends moved to that very apartment to meet the sunrise. I had sold mine by then, and I silenced my mild dislike of the gloomy place by thinking that what had happened there was not true, and that it was safe to sit in a house full of people in the early morning hours. And so it went. Jokes, toasts, congratulations, gruff banter, and flirting by the mostly unjuvenile and cynical guests distracted me from my memories. I didn't drink much, and Stefan's overdrunk friends got into heated arguments about trivia. They even talked about the collection, but nothing that Aunt Sonia had mentioned came up in conversation. When it became clearer outside the windows, the guests began to disperse, and the two remaining guests quarreled with the host and, in a drunken rage, called a cab and drove away, not out of fear but out of conscience. We were amused to watch them, but when Stefan volunteered to walk them to their car, I realized that I would have to stay in the apartment alone for a while. It would be weird to follow them. Besides, wine. Bravado? A desire to prove to myself that I was normal? Or a combination of the two. I decided to see if that tape was that dangerous or if I was dreaming. What am I risking? It was morning and life outside. As soon as the door closed behind Stepan, I rushed to the rack. The stupidly named CD had been spotted at the beginning of the party, and I quickly got it into the player. It buzzed and started working. Uncle hadn't come back yet. I stared at the screen with an evil grin and snickered. So, what? Are we playing? The blackness didn't scare me. Like before, it just condensed into the rectangular frame of the screen and was silent. What, I couldn't see the black background? When suddenly, sooner than I felt it should, the searing yellow eyes popped out at me, I remembered everything at once. Down to the last detail of the frame and the moan from the other side. Knowing what was about to start, and where it would lead, I barked a curse, turned off the tape and, gritting my teeth, pressed the remote so hard it rattled. Everything stopped. I glanced around, squeamishly extracted the disc, and put it back. See? I whispered behind me. A split second later, I literally jumped through the unlocked front door, nearly knocking Uncle Stefan back into the apartment, hiccuping and repeating into the phone, "We see." Let me tell you. Apparently, John was really offended. Looking at me, he asked what happened and why I was all white. I danced on the doorstep, could hardly put my shoes on, said that I had forgotten about the important meeting, and, muttering something else, left the house for good. I took a bus to the next town, and from there to my place. I didn't tell Aunt Sonia, Stefan, or the girl about the 5 minutes of my experience. There were no bad experiences after that. But one thing I know for sure now is that it really happens to people. It's a fact. A fact that has forever deprived me of my former skepticism. Is it hard to live like this? You have no idea how, and thank God you have no idea. I have become kinder, gentler, more attentive to people and their concerns. Whenever possible, I try to help the homeless and the poor. It is there. If not always and not everywhere, then certainly in the objects and places that hold the memory of the past. Of a past that cannot be brought back. Where people were deprived, where they suffered. Where most are remembered. The unknown creator of the tape knew something about it and found the key to the contact, getting them to reveal themselves. It doesn't matter who he is or where he is from, what matters is them. They do not wish us harm. Only grief. They don't want to frighten us, only to share a sense of loss and longing as the only connection to this world. I wish there were other means, but here, one must think, both they and, even more so, we are powerless. They are not to be feared. They look with sadness. They don't just look, they see. And they want to comfort. They are real. Why do I know this for sure? Because that morning I was sitting in front of the TV facing the front door, and a woman's voice rang out behind me. We see.